Hello and welcome to the My School channel. My name is Angela, and in this video we're going to continue the government topic by topic video lesson. So we're moving on to colonial administration, and we're going to begin with the British Colonial Administration. We're going to talk about how the British colonized most of British West Africa. So please stay with us, don't go anywhere, we'll be right back. Welcome back to the My School channel. Like I said earlier, we are moving on to British Colonial Administration, so let's dive right into it. Alright, so here's a list of things we're going to be discussing. We'll discuss colonialism and the history of British Colonial Administration, and then we're going to move on to the indirect rule system and many more. So let's begin with the definition of colonialism. Alright, colonialism is the imposition of a more developed culture over a less developed one, typically backed by expansionist and economic motives. We've discussed the concept of colonialism as a form of government earlier on in another video lesson. So now we're going to discuss colonialism here in British West Africa. So it is the imposition of a more developed culture over a less developed one. Okay, so the colonial masters come to a colonized territory to impose their culture onto them because they believe their culture is less developed, and so they come to impose a better culture on them. So colonialism is usually typically backed by expansionist and economic motives. Expansionists in the sense that they tend to develop their empire. They intend to get more land, acquire more land so that they can expand their empire. The British Empire, for instance, they want to expand the British Empire. And then it is also backed by economic motives in the sense that they need more raw materials in order to develop their economy. Okay? So European capitalist countries established political, economic, military, and cultural dominance over other parts of the world, which was initially less developed and therefore could not resist domination. Okay? Originally, it was the idea of protecting a market for industry at home to the idea of creating a new protected market by seizing colonies abroad. So the major reason why they decided to adopt this form of government in other territories of the world is in order to protect a market, right? They needed these raw materials in other territories so that they can power their industries back home. So they were trying to protect the market for raw materials. Then eventually it evolved into a system of seizing colonies abroad so that they can dominate that colony, right, politically, economically, and in other sense. So this was so in the late 19th century. This concept of colonialism carries both positive and negative connotations. So you can see colonialism in a positive light and in a negative light. So there are two broad ways of understanding colonialism. We have settler colonialism and the colonies of exploitation. So we're going to discuss these two various strands of colonialism. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, so we're going to begin with settler colonialism. So in its early stages, colonialism was driven by a European spirit of expansion as countries like Britain, France, and Spain sought to extend their influence across the globe. So that's how colonialism started. Most of these European countries wanted to expand their territories. They were seeking adventure. They were trying to create a new state outside of their homeland. So most of them moved to regions that is presently known as the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Okay? So most of the settlers migrated to escape economic hardship and political restrictions in Europe and to create a new and better territory. So they wanted to create a new state in some of these lands, and so they established colonies in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, and in New Zealand. These territories were called colonies and became areas where Europeans established new societies modeled on their own cultural values, systems, and governance structures. So they came together to establish a constitution, a political system, and all of these were adopted by the people that moved to these different territories. So these forms of colonialism were not without conflicts. Indigenous populations in these regions often faced displacement as settlers claimed land and resources. So United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, people were originally living there before the Europeans came there. So they continue to face conflicts with these indigenous populations. Okay, so this is the negative impact of this settler colonialism. Now we're going to move on to colonialism of exploitation. This is the form of colonialism that we're going to focus on in this video lesson, right? It is the type of colonialism that emerged with the expansion of European powers into Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So these are the three continents where the Europeans sought to expand their territories into. So it is often referred to as the colonies of exploitation. This form of colonialism was not about settling in a new land to build a society. Instead, it involved exploiting the indigenous people and natural resources for the sole benefit of the colonizer. Again, the Industrial Revolution began in the European society. They needed more raw materials for their industries, and this is the reason why they came to these territories in Africa, Asia, and Latin America to find raw materials, to source for raw materials so that they can take it to their industries. European powers primarily sought to extract raw materials such as minerals, spices, and agricultural products to fuel their own industrial economies. The native populations were often forced into labor by cultivating crops or mining to supply raw materials for European markets. Colonial authorities established systems of political control that limited the rights and autonomy of indigenous populations. So after a while, they started to develop a political system within these colonies in order for them to have full direct control over these colonies. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, so we're going to discuss British Colonial Administration, especially in British West Africa. So British interest in Africa was at first primarily economic. The reason why they came to Africa was mostly to source for raw materials. They did not have an intention of governing the people of Africa politically. So it was driven by the demands of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. The industrial era started in Europe in the 19th century. Before the 19th century, the Europeans were farming just like the rest of us. They were farming in their farms and getting agricultural products. And they were using laborers to convert these agricultural products to finished products. But with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, machines started being developed. You had tractors and those other machines that can be used in the farms. And we had equipment and machineries in the factories that were helping to convert these raw materials into finished goods. So because of that, they found out that the raw materials within the British Empire was not enough to fuel their industries, and so they needed more raw materials. This is the reason why they went to Africa, to Asia, and to Latin America to source for these raw materials. However, over the years, it transformed into the political, cultural, religious, and social domination of different regions. So after a while, the British people now started to dominate these areas politically, culturally, religiously, and socially. They were trying to impose their culture onto these African territories. Okay, so the following is a brief historical background to British occupation of Africa. It began in the late 18th and early 19th centuries with the British Industrial Revolution. We've already talked about this. So this problem was not only faced by the British people. The problem of sourcing raw materials was not only faced by the British people, but by most industrialized European societies like Portugal, France, Spain, Germany, and the Netherlands. So it was not only the British Empire that was sourcing for raw materials in these various territories. All the other countries in Europe too were sourcing for raw materials. So to sustain this economic industrial growth, Britain needed vast quantities of raw materials. Africa, with its rich natural resources, soon became a prime location for these raw materials. They began at first by trading with African merchants who controlled the extraction of these raw materials, and then moved on to extracting the materials themselves through various companies that were established within the African territories. So thus, British interest in Africa started as purely economic, with the aim of acquiring resources that could support their industrial and manufacturing needs. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, so the economic motive now transformed into a religious motive, right? They wanted to spread the Christianity into this African territory. So in the early 19th century, a significant movement emerged in Britain to abolish the transatlantic slave trade, led by philanthropists and abolitionists who viewed human trafficking as morally reprehensible. Okay, so we had people in the British society who were trying to abolish this transatlantic slave trade that most of the African merchants were involved in. They were selling their fellow men to other territories in the world, and so they wanted to abolish slave trade. Then British abolitionists pressured their government to intervene in slave trade, and this led to the British ban on slave trade in 1807 and slavery in 1883. So by the 1850s and 60s, the Christian missionaries had entrenched themselves in various parts of British West Africa. So this is the religious motive. They were trying to spread Christianity into the African territory. So their motive was to bring the benefits of Western civilization to the people by educating them. To this end, they began to build schools and admit pupils for training. With the spread of education, they grew a body of youngsters who had acquired Western education and were ready to undertake teaching and evangelical work among the African people. They also acted as a link between the foreigners and the locals and helped to spread British influence across British West Africa. So after that came the Berlin Conference, which took place between 1884 and 1885. So the intensifying European interest in Africa led to conflict among European nations over territorial claims. To avoid conflicts, European leaders convened at the Berlin Conference. Berlin is in Germany. The Germans had a conflict of interest with other European nations that were trying to acquire territories within the African society. So all of these African leaders gathered in Berlin to have this conference between 1884 and 1895. So Africa was partitioned without African representation or consent. Africa was not represented when this meeting was taking place, and then they divided Africa among these European powers. The conference established rules for European powers to claim territories, which they referred to as spheres of influence. Through this process, Britain acquired West African territories, including Nigeria, Ghana, which was then known as the Gold Coast, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and the Gambia. Now let's move on to the next slide. Now we're going to discuss the history of British Colonial Administration here in Nigeria. So the British occupation in Nigeria, just like in other West African territories, was at first primarily economic. We've talked about that. In the 1700s, they had settlements and forts on the coast of the River Niger and traded with local merchants who came from different parts of the territory. So they were not able to go into the country as a result of the poor climatic condition that was not favorable to the British people and because of malaria. So they did not have any defense against these conditions, and so they settled on the coast of the Nigerian territories and traded with African merchants who came along with raw materials to sell to the British people. So these merchants traded raw materials such as palm oil, palm kernel, and ivory that the British valued, as well as slaves. So at that time when they just came, the British were still involved in slave trade. They were still buying slaves from these African merchants. And so they traded each of these items for items like bronze, mirrors, and guns, which the British people readily had and were willing to offer to the African merchants. So before British government's intervention in the early 1800s, thousands of slaves were traded per year by local merchants in the various kingdoms within the Nigerian territories. So they sold these slaves to Portuguese and British slave traders at the various ports. The most famous slave port at that time was the one located in Badagry. Now let's move on to the next slide. However, in 1807, the British government passed a Slave Trade Act which prohibited British subjects from engaging in slave trade. So from then on, they began to lobby other European nations, Portugal, Spain, Germany, and the rest of them, to follow suit to abolish slave trade as well. But slavery and slave trade did not cease in the Nigerian territory until 1883. In the 1840s, missionaries began to operate in Lagos and Ibadan. The first missions were opened by the Church of England's Church Missionary Society, or CMS. So they were the first mission in the Nigerian territories. Other denominations, including Catholics and Protestants, arrived into the Nigerian territories and divvied up the territories. CMS worked among the Yorubas, while the Catholic missionaries worked with the Igbos. So Samuel Ajayi Crowther, a very famous Nigerian, became the first Anglican bishop of the Niger. He was a liberated Yoruba slave who had been educated in Sierra Leone and in Britain, where he was ordained before returning to his homeland with the first group of CMS missionary. So he is the first Anglican bishop in Nigeria. Now let's move on to the next slide. Okay, as the volume of trade increased along the coast of the Niger River, British merchants requested that the British governor appoint a consul over the region. So a man named John Beecroft was appointed as the consul of the Bights of Benin and Biafra in 1849. So these Bights of Benin and Biafra, we are talking about the area along the Nigerian territory, the area of the coast along the Nigerian territory, where the British people traded with the African merchants. So most of the ships, the British ships, they were gathered along this territory, along this coast of Nigeria, and they were waiting for African merchants to come down from different territories in Nigeria, different kingdoms in Nigeria, to come and trade with them. So this John Beecroft was the consul over this territory. So the British government created a court at Bonny in Lagos. Lagos is around here, so it is very close to the coast. So they created a court in Lagos in 1850 to oversee trade disputes. So in 1856, and that court was created in Calabar. So Calabar is around here. It's around here. So they created these two different courts so that they can arbitrate issues between the African merchants and the British merchants as they sold goods to one another. So we'll now move on to the birth of the Lagos colony. So in 1851, Oba Akintoye, a deposed king of Lagos, sought British ships to help him to the throne. When we were discussing the pre-colonial administration in Nigeria, we talked about how there was a lot of wars between the Yoruba kingdoms as a result of the fall of the Oyo Empire. So many kingdoms were trying to gain prominence amongst each other, and also within the kingdoms there was conflict between the leaders. So different leaders were trying to vie for the position of Oba in the various Yoruba kingdoms. So there was a lot of war around that time when the British people came into the Nigerian society. So one of these wars was within Lagos. It was between Oba Akintoye and Oba Kosoko. The two of them were vying for the position of the Oba of Lagos. So Oba Akintoye was a deposed king. Oba Kosoko was the king that they selected to lead the people after Akintoye. Oba Akintoye was not okay with this, so he sought British assistance. Beecroft agreed on the condition that slave trade be abolished and British merchants have a monopoly in commodities against the Brazilians and Portuguese. So when they have a monopoly, they'll be able to buy all of the goods from the Lagos people without them selling it to other European territories. So that was the treaty that would be signed with Oba Akintoye if he was able to help them to win the war. So the Royal Navy bombarded Lagos in November 1851 and hoisted the pro-slavery Oba Kosoko and established a treaty with the newly installed Oba Akintoye, who was expectedly more amenable to British interests. Now let's move on to the next slide. Alright, Lagos was however annexed as a British colony on the 6th of August 1861. Okay? What it means for a colony to be annexed, that means it has been won over by the British people and now it is now fully part of the British Empire. That's what it means. So Lagos was now a colony under the British Empire, and then this was done via the Lagos Treaty of Cession. Lagos now became known as a crown colony. King Dosumu, the ascendant to the throne after Oba Akintoye died in 1853, had his power significantly reduced by the British government. So as a colony, Lagos was now protected and governed directly from Britain. Africans born in the colony were British subjects with full rights, including access to the courts. They were officially British citizens, okay, and they had access to British courts. This is different from what we call protectorates in later times, okay. So the protectorates of southern and northern Nigeria, as we're going to discuss later on, were different from the crown colony. These were protected people, but they remained under the jurisdiction of their traditional rulers. Unlike the Lagos colony, where they were ruled directly by the British people, there was direct rule in the crown colony, but indirect rule in other protectorates in Nigeria. After the cession of Lagos in 1861, events became more dramatic. It would seem as if the beginning of the second half of the 19th century had let loose the tides of imperialism. We've talked about imperialism as an ideology, the desire to gain other territories in order to impose your culture, your political system onto them. So we've come to the end of this segment. I believe it was educative and enlightening. If you would like to continue on this journey with us, please go down to the link in the description below. This takes you to my school website where you can subscribe for the government topic by topic video lesson. There you can continue on this journey with us. So we're going to continue with the history of the British Colonial Administration in Nigeria. We're also going to discuss the difference between the crown colony and the protectorate. We're going to discuss that in full detail and see the difference between the direct rule in the crown colony and the indirect rule in Nigeria. I hope to see you there. I believe you're enjoying this content. If yes, please do not forget to hit the like button, click on the subscribe button, and lastly, tap on the notification bell to get informed as soon as we release the next videos.